On December 7th, 1941, my then 21-year-old father was sitting in a movie theater in Birmingham, Alabama. He had recently moved there to work for the DuPont Chemical Company. The movie he was watching was interrupted to announce that the Japanese were attacking Pearl Harbor. Now, I wasn't born for 15 years after that, but my father talked about the attack on Pearl Harbor. I heard him tell the story to many different people many times. So I know a fair amount about how he enlisted, how he hoped to become an Air Force pilot and ended up being on a construction team that helped build the airstrips in the South Pacific that eventually led to the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. What he never mentioned was why the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. And to the best of my recollections, though the fact that the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor often came up in the course of my public school and university education, no one ever mentioned why. Were they just in the neighborhood? Were they crazy? Were they demonic? Now, we have historians and military veterans here who undoubtedly know the sequence of historical events, so I'm not going to ask you to say it out loud, but I want to challenge everyone in our internet audience and everyone here to just think about, do you know why Japan sent aircraft carriers and bombers across the Pacific to attack our fleet in Hawaii? My suspicion is, though it was an event that changed the course of history, many of us, 75 years later, have no idea why they did it. And because I don't want to lose your attention for the next 15 minutes, even though Dr. Adams told me that it is impossible to explain in a couple of sentences, I'm going to try. And no matter how inadequate that is, Dr. Adams, please forgive me in advance. Japan had been trying to expand their control over trade in Asia, so they had invaded China. We didn't want to lose trade with China, so we placed an embargo on scrap metals and oil shipments to Japan, which cut their fuel supply by 90%. So Japan was either going to have to surrender or they were going to have to go to war with us because they were going to be crippled by our embargo. So they decided that the best thing for them to do would be to try to sink as much of our fleet in the Pacific as they could before the war started. Now, they were mistaken, but in December of 1941, the fact that they would lose that war was anything but evident. And so they thought they had a chance. They struck first. We would have been at war with them in a couple or 3 months, no matter whether they had attacked or not, but that was what lit the fuse. Now, I'm not in any way trying to justify the surprise attack on our Hawaiian naval port. I'm just saying that it didn't happen in a vacuum. There were reasons, not good reasons, not enough reasons, not justifiable reasons, but there were reasons. Very few things happen in a vacuum. They happen in reaction to the other things that are going on. But today is not December 7th. Today is September 11th. It is the anniversary of our Pearl Harbor, the day that changed our history, the day that has led us now into 15 years of war, a war that has lasted nearly 4 times as long as the United States' involvement in World War II. Again, not that I want you to say anything out loud, but do you feel like you know why those 19 men came to the United States, took pilot training, and then hijacked 4 commercial airliners, killing themselves and nearly 3,000 other people on 9/11 of 2001? Do you feel like you know why they did it? Now, you were told that it was because of religious fanaticism, and I hope that nobody here believes that trash today. That obviously was not it. President George W. Bush preposterously told us at the time that it was because they envied our freedom or despised us because of our freedom. I'm surprised that his pants didn't just catch on fire spontaneously when he said that. But why did they do it? There's no justification for it. There's no justification. But there was a reason. I would no more try to excuse the 9/11 attacks than I would the Pearl Harbor attack. But then I might not be the right person to ask. I don't think there was any excuse for bombing Nagasaki and Hiroshima. I don't think there was any excuse for the traditional warfare methods in which we bombed Tokyo and Dresden. Bombing cities, killing citizens, I'm against that, always. There's never a good reason for that. For me, the question that really matters is, what on earth can we do to keep this from happening again? What have we learned? What do we know now that would keep this from happening again? Can we understand? Can we figure out how, in a global environment, to buy and to sell, to trade and to build, to travel, to immigrate around the globe in a way that doesn't end up leading us down a blind alley where the only way out is to go to war? Like for my father's generation, we all know where we were on September 11th of 2001. I was actually sitting in my dentist chair getting a filling. It was a Tuesday morning. That day we had important and rather controversial long-range planning meetings scheduled at the church where I worked at the time. None of us had the heart to go through with the meetings, and in fact, even though we'd gone through months of questionnaires and interviews and planning surveys for a long-range plan, none of us ever put that material together and looked at it again, because how can you plan in a world that has totally been turned upside down? I had just returned from a trip to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. I'd been given a grant to write Sunday school literature about the Holocaust to be used in Christian churches, and even though I had piles of books and notes, I never looked at them again. It didn't make any sense to me to try to write curriculum about a Holocaust from generations ago when we had a new one that we were staring in the face. I correctly believed that there would be a backlash against Muslims living in the United States. Since we canceled all of our church meetings, I only knew one Muslim at the time, and he happened to live right across the street from me. He worked for the Missouri Highway Department. I went over to speak to him and discovered that he had gone into hiding because of threats from some of his government co-workers. So I mowed his lawn. Didn't really need to be mown. I needed to do something that said, I'm not going to hate you. I'm not going to lash out against you. So I cut his grass. I think it's the only time I've ever cut someone else's grass. 15 of the 19 terrorists who hijacked those 4 planes were from Saudi Arabia. But Saudi Arabia is a very important trading partner to the United States, so no serious consideration was ever given to attacking Saudi Arabia. The terrorists involved had, some of them participated in training camps, al-Qaeda training camps that were located in Afghanistan. Now, we'd not been attacked by Afghanistan. Goodness knows they couldn't. They didn't have airplanes. They didn't have ships. They had a small army, but they weren't going to drive a rebuilt 57 Chevy across the Atlantic and come attack us. But we attacked Afghanistan. Not just the terrorist training camps, the whole country. Why all of Afghanistan? Why on earth did we attack the entire nation? Because, I'm going to say, we were scared. We were scared. Scared people don't think well. Fear doesn't help you to make good decisions. We were scared, and we felt like we had to lash out at somebody. There was, in 2001, virtually no visible protest against attacking Afghanistan. Now, I personally thought it was unnecessary, but I couldn't find anyone among my church members or among the clergy of the city. I reached out to them. No one would even discuss protesting the invasion of Afghanistan. By March of 2003, it became evident that sweeping through Afghanistan had done nothing to slake our thirst for revenge. And so we were going to attack Iraq, even though hundreds of weapons inspectors had told us they didn't have weapons of mass destruction. They not only were not allied with al-Qaeda, they were enemies of al-Qaeda, but we were going to attack them anyway, for no reason at all. None. By that time, some of the peaceniks had organized enough to protest, and I joined them, but I was the only active member of clergy to be seen at a public protest at that time. Others eventually joined, but for the first year or two, I don't think that anyone who was drawing a paycheck from a church ever decided to join in. And maybe they were right, because I was certainly laying the foundations for my own eventual Waterloo with my former church and the whole of my former denomination. So far as institutional religion goes, let me just say, there is no crime so vigorously punished as being too right at the wrong time. Our nation moved into what has euphemistically been called a war on terrorism. Now that phrase never made any sense. You can go to war pitting an army against an army. You can attack a geographical location. But how do you go to war against an idea? How do you bomb a way of thinking? The terrorists who conspired to attack the USA on 9/11 15 years ago were motivated both by generations of anger at the West for the exploitation of colonialism, the cultural domination of Western corporations, our fashion, our foods, our TV, movies, our education forms. And they felt that their entire culture and their religion was being undermined by the West. They were and they are furious about American support for Israel. They see Israel as a military occupation of a Muslim territory. And why wouldn't they see it that way? It is a military occupation of a previously Muslim country. The fuse was lit by the placement of American military bases in the Middle East following the Persian Gulf War and our support for dictators in that region of the world that were secular. But that was then. That was almost a generation ago. And here's what I want to say today. And it seems so obvious, I don't even know why I'm saying it. I really don't know why I feel like I have to say this, except for the fact that only the tiniest fraction of Americans will find it to not be offensive and possibly un-American or even treasonous to say what I'm going to say. But you remember how you felt in the days, weeks, and months after 9/11. Every year on September 11th, the television networks will oftentimes play complete recordings. CNN this morning playing start to finish every second of the coverage that they gave. So we relive it. We see the first plane hit, and they speculate about that, all wrong. The second plane hits, then another plane hits the Pentagon, and we relive it moment by moment, how we felt when we saw people jumping out of the buildings and falling to their death to avoid dying in the flames inside. You know the sorrow. You know the anger, the fear that you felt as the months went by and they just kept telling us stories of people that had died. We just kept hearing another piece of the story. And then we saw the stock market fall. We know that millions of people had their retirement savings just disappear into the ether. We felt the pain of the housing crash that didn't come for another 5 years, and the rising body count of our fallen soldiers who died in Afghanistan and Iraq. We're reminded now of 9/11 every time you try to get on an airplane. You may never have spent 10 minutes trying to understand why those terrorists struck here on 9/11, but you have felt in your own body the anger and the fear that has prompted the creation of the Homeland Security Administration, the TSA, that led us into wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. It wasn't really anyone who was actually from Iraq or Afghanistan, but 19 Muslims who were from somewhere over there killed 3,000 Americans, many of whom were also Muslims from the Middle East who just happened to be working in the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. And in response to those heartless murders of civilians, we have waged 15 years of war and retribution. So what do we got? Is terrorism dead now? Given what we have done in response to 3,000 civilian deaths, if we would lead 15 years of war, spend trillions of dollars in response to the deaths of 3,000 civilians, what would we have done if it had been much worse? What if they had done the same thing 10 times in a row? What if it was 30,000? What if they'd done it 100 times, if it was 300,000? Or 200 times? What if it was 600,000 dead Americans? What would we do? So how many people do we have to kill before they all decide that they like us better? How do you bomb them until we become friends? Have our wars killed terrorism? No, but it has killed, conservatively, 600,000 civilians in Afghanistan and Iraq. Some estimates put it at 1.5 million. I don't know how you can be that wrong, but let's just say the most conservative number, 600,000. What if that had been done to us? 9/11 after 9/11 after 9/11 after 9/11, 200 times. What would we do then? Folks, by killing 600,000 civilians, have we killed terrorism? Are we fighting for our freedom? No. What we are doing is creating future generations of terrorists. By killing their mothers while they were hanging out laundry to dry, their fathers while they were out in the fields, their brothers and sisters while they were playing in the streets. You, who live in one of the most information-saturated nations in the history of the world, may have little idea why the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, or why Al-Qaeda attacked New York and Washington, D.C. How much do you think that the impoverished and largely illiterate people of Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, and Yemen know about why our armies invaded them? Or why our drones still fly overhead firing missiles at homes, schools, and hospitals in their neighborhood? Many of them have never heard of 9/11. And some of the ones who have, my old college roommate was an Arabic interrogator, and he told me people he interrogated thought that 9/11 was in retaliation for our invasion of Afghanistan. That's how much they know about it. One of my favorite people in the world, Malala Yousafzai, God bless her. She was herself a victim of Taliban extremism. She was 15 years old when a man got on her school bus, shot her right in the head, just for going to school. 2 years later, after she was shot, while she was still recovering, she could still barely speak, hadn't finished high school yet, she got to visit the White House and meet President Obama. And I'm sure he thought he was doing her a favor. But this 17-year-old, badly injured, disabled child, the victim of Islamic extremism, patiently explained to the leader of the free world what I am trying to say to you now, that drone strikes, bombing cities, invading armies do not bring an end to terrorism. They cause terrorism. None of us here today will live long enough to see the end of terrorism because there are too many young people in the Middle East whose Pearl Harbor, whose 9/11 not only came early in their lives, but it came again and again and again and again. For them, it has hardened their hearts beyond cure. There is no giving them back their mother or their father or their brothers or sisters, their neighbors or cousins. But there is one thing we can do. One thing. We can stop creating new generations of terrorists. Amen. We can begin to work for peace. We can try to understand them and their culture and work to help them to understand us and our culture. You've heard me quote Malala before. With a gun, you can kill a terrorist. With education, you can kill terrorism. It is time for us to begin to teach the ways of peace. Amen.
You have been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at Reverend Dr. Ray at AOL.com for more information.